The left, the new left, or maybe a better way to call it is a reaffirmation of what the left originally was, it was supposed to be, has pushed back on the notion of identity politics that is, let's say, led to where we are now in our current political situation. And you can call it somewhat of a backlash. Ultimately, the Democratic Party has used identity politics in lieu of economic relief. This idea that they're supposed to be the relief valve to the capitalistic system. And because they are captured by the people they're supposed to regulate and the people who they are supposed to philosophically, in some degree, even be against, particularly if you're talking about representing workers, they have used identity politics for political expedience. We, on wherever I consider myself on the political spectrum, has pushed back against this. That said, the pushback is specific to the Democratic Party's use of it, not necessarily as an absolute. That needs to be very clear. This idea of identity is personal and is integral to the individuals of who they are, particularly me, talking from the perspective of an African American living in America, that, same amount of pot use, 4 times as much in prison, longer prison sentences. Civil rights is a real thing. And identity politics, used divisively in the way that the Democratic Party has used it, is problematic to say the least. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a real issue, a real and personal issue. Hopefully, over the context of this show, over the past year, I've put in caveats, and if I'm not mistaken, I've even done videos making this distinction that it's somewhat of a gradient. It's not a this or that, it's a both. Identity politics and the use of identity politics solely by itself, yes, is a divisive issue, but it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. In many respects, it is both. The Trump administration, especially with the religious right that he's accrued or associated himself with, that in and of itself is just a bizarre thing. This guy has been an adulterer his entire life, has just had sex and paid for sex with a porn star, is supposedly the representative of the religious right. But whatever. In this particular case, Mike Pence is on his left or right side, depending upon where you want to put Mike Pence, he's standing on any particular day. And they have had a particular agenda. Trump has joked that Pence would hang gays. Trump, that joke may not necessarily be that far from true. The Trump administration last weekend has tried to slide through a measure to try to get Human Health and Services essentially to reclassify transgender. It is a radical attack on the civil rights of people who are of transgender, who consider themselves and designate themselves as transgender. The Obama administration put through certain civil rights protections for transgender, and the Trump administration is trying to eradicate those protections. Let's take a look at this story. I want to say this. This is not a this or that. It's both. Meaning from the standpoint of the left, it's both. The left needs to be radically protective of issues of identity while simultaneously pushing for issues of economics, because both of those things are related to one another. It's not one or the other, it's both. You can't disassociate those things. At the point where the economic crisis hit and all of those people lost their houses, many of those people were African Americans because African Americans had their wealth within their house. The amount of wealth that African Americans have in this country compared to whites is astonishingly low. That wasn't magic. It was policy. Even during New Deal politics, the African Americans, FDR, kept them out of that because of the political will of some of the people who were in Congress. If he wanted to get that New Deal through, he couldn't include African Americans in the New Deal politics. I'm saying African Americans because that's the way I relate to the world in this very specific case. But it's how I make my gateway into this idea of transgender, LGBTQ. Race and identification of gender may not necessarily be the same thing, but God knows they are in the same sandbox. And both of those things deserve civil rights protections. The idea that the Trump administration is radically rolling this back should be resisted across the left. I got to be honest, there should be agreements here in regards to I stand by you, you stand by me, and we're out there together holding hands up. I don't understand how these things are factioned into this particular thing for this part of the left and that part of the left. All of these things are united under one umbrella, and all of these things should be resisted together. Take a look at this story. This story hasn't got as much of attention as the story should have gotten. Trump administration trying to define transgender out of existence. The New York Times gets a memo of changes that are going to take place under the Trump administration. Transgender could be defined out of existence under the Trump administration. A series of decisions by the Obama administration loosened the legal concept of gender in federal programs, including the education and health care recognition of gender largely as an individual choice and not determined by the sex of the assigned birth. The policy prompted fights over bathrooms, dormitories, single-sex programs, and other arenas where gender was once seen as a simple concept. Conservatives, especially evangelical Christians, were incensed. And that's where all this comes from. Their magical God. They want their policies to be defined by a magical God. Now, the Department of Health and Human Services is spearheading an effort to establish a legal definition of sex under Title IX, the federal civil rights law that bans gender discrimination in education programs that receive federal financial assistance, according to the memo obtained by the New York Times. Sex means a person's status as a male or female based on immutable biological traits defined by or before birth, the department proposed in the memo, which was drafted and has been circulating since last spring. The sex listed on a person at birth certificate as originally issued shall constitute definitive proof of a person's sex unless rebutted by reliable genetic evidence. The new definition would essentially eradicate federal recognition of the estimated 1.4 million Americans who have opted to recognize themselves, surgically or otherwise, as a gender other than what they were born into. Meaning the self-determination of an individual is being destroyed because of religious beliefs. That's what we're talking about. This takes the position that what the medical community understands about the patient, what people understand about themselves, is irrelevant because the government disagrees, said Catherine E. Lehman, who led the Education Department's Office of Civil Rights in the Obama administration and helps write transgender guidance that is being undone. The move will be the most significant of a series of maneuvers, large and small, to exclude the population from civil rights protections and roll back the Obama administration's more fluid recognition of gender identity. The Trump administration has sought to bar transgender people from serving in the military and has legally challenged civil rights protections for the groups embedded in the nation's healthcare law. Several agencies have withdrawn Obama-era policy that recognized gender identity in schools, prisons, and homeless shelters. The administration even tried to remove the question of gender identity from the 2020 census survey and a national survey of elderly citizens. Trans rights are human rights. They are. Human beings. Human beings who don't necessarily feel comfortable in an identity that they're in. They choose what they feel comfortable in. I'm not saying this to some loony degree where a person says I'm a green alien. I'm talking about regular human beings who say, this is not what I am. And they determine, they choose. The Trump administration is trying to erase these people from the face of the earth, at least from the standpoint of a legal sense. I'm not going to keep this one long. I want this one to be short, sweet, and to the point. All of us, regardless of the way that the Democratic Party has used identity politics, it doesn't necessarily mean that identity politics are not real, or the very least identity doesn't matter to the people who have their identities being attacked. We should be united on this. This story should have gotten far more resonance than this story has gotten. So, from this little channel, I know I lessen identity politics because they use it as a way of ignoring the economic realities that face us. But again, I make the point that it's not one or the other. It's both. And from the standpoint of the left, we should be exuberant in defending these issues, these civil rights issues, while simultaneously making noise, rattling, shaking about the economics. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm not gonna keep this one long. I have a slate of shows that I want to do today, and I've been spending a long time doing the longer videos. But so I'm gonna end it here. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through Patreon. And by the way, I'm very serious about this. We should be arm in arm on this. In the same way you have the women's rights movements, in the same way you have African Americans who keep doing those movements, those things are not specific and individual to the different groups. Yes, each particular identity group may have very specific things, but as a collective, we should be united and we should be arm in arm on each and every one of these issues. The LGBT community should not be alone in this. The African American community should be right beside them. The women's community should be right beside them, hand in hand, because the rain that falls hits all of us. We're not individual and specific. And by the way, I would add environmentalists, Black Lives Matter, all that stuff. All of these groups are fundamentally in the same sandbox, whether they recognize it or not. Join up. The battle's on.